Dr. Gabri, when do you want us to start?
Yes, now.
Okay. فاحنا طبعا سعداء جدا. We're very happy to have Dr. Monica Hanna with us, and thanks for accepting our invitation. And I also invited Dr. Monica's boss, اللي هو General Ismail Abdel Ghaffar. He said he will try to attend, and many of you know him as the commander of the Military Technical College. هو دفعة 15.
رئيس الأكاديمية دلوقتي.
بالظبط، وكان هو رئيس الأكاديمية دلوقتي، وكان فدخل الفنية العسكرية قبل حرب 73 أو ساعتها يعني، وتخرج سنة 78. Dr. Monica is a well-known international figure طبعا in the world of archaeology, specifically Egyptology. She studied at the American University in Cairo, and her study was in archaeological chemistry. And then she continued with her master's degree at the university, and later went to Pisa to get her PhD degree. And she did that, of course, and then she worked as a postdoctoral fellow من 2011 ل 2012 at the Humboldt University in Germany. Currently, I want to make sure that okay, can I ask everybody to mute their mute your microphone, because I hear some echo. Okay. Can everybody please mute their phone? Okay, good. Okay, so okay, Suzanne, can you please, Susanna, I think if you can mute your phone, can we mute her? Okay. Okay, so now, right now, Monica, correct me if I'm wrong. You're an associate professor and acting dean, College of Archaeology and Cultural Heritage at the Academy. And she founded many groups. She's a big fighter for the monuments of Egypt. And I saw a petition that she is sponsoring, and she needs signatures for people to return 3 of the best monuments from Egypt: Rosetta Stone in the British Museum, the head of Nefertiti in Germany, and of course the Zodiac in the Louvre. And I was just there 2 weeks ago and I saw it. Please add the scribe statue, because I think this is one of the oldest statues. It's amazing colors, and it's sitting there in the Louvre. She was named the Monuments Woman to 2014 by UNESCO. Received several awards. Some of them are the Safe Beacon Award in 2014. And she was chosen as one of the 50 most influential women in Egypt in 2020. There is a book called The Future of Egyptology, is coming out in March of 2025. If you want to buy this book, I don't know if I do that for Dr. Gabri. Told me that if you want to tell him about it, and he will give you a good discount because he has a deal with Amazon. So we are all looking for this book. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Monica, and Monica can pick it up from there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wagia, for such a lovely introduction. I'm very happy to be here. And it's the first time this talk I first gave at the Congress of Egyptology precisely 1 year ago as the keynote speech for the Congress of Egyptology. It was based on the draft of the book I had just submitted that's coming out hopefully very soon. I have a bachelor in Egyptology from the American University in Cairo, and so I've always been self-critical of the discipline to which I have a bachelor for. So today I'd like to discuss different ideas that I have developed throughout my career. I graduated in 2004. from the American University, and I've worked on many archaeological missions. I've worked on different heritage projects. And so I've developed a different interaction to Egyptology that perhaps is a little unusual and perhaps is quite critical. So let me show you this. The next slide is Egyptology. What is Egyptology? And I found this very funny cartoon here that says, this is what my mom thinks we do, what my friends thinks we do, what History Channel thinks we do, what Hollywood thinks we do, what I think we do, and what we really do. So it's always this idea of the fascination of ancient Egypt, that they think that Egyptology is this very peculiar field of study that's subject of cinema and film and many thrillers and books and even fiction. So Egyptology has this very wide consumption, but actually the field of Egyptology itself is what I'm trying to critique in my book, so I can actually look at the future of Egyptology, how we can take, for Egyptology, we always think about the past, we always think about ancient Egypt, but how can we actually think of the future of Egyptology as a discipline and also as studying and preserving our ancient Egyptian heritage? So I always say that the future of ancient Egypt lies in our hands as practitioners in the field. And modern Egyptology was an academic discipline conceived by Europeans and for Europeans. Egyptology has been heavily critiqued as having such an attitude. I quote here from an Egyptologist called Juan Carlos Garcia, who called Egyptology as a cursed discipline. So he wrote, such an attitude that disconnects the past from the present is further reinforced by certain historical narratives that does not take into consideration the present day nature of historical and archaeological narratives, despite cultural practices that connects the past and the present today. I apologize. This quotation is from the paper by Renan Lemos, and also Juan Carlos Garcia wrote a book chapter calling Egyptology the cursed discipline. But why everyone is now suddenly critiquing Egyptology? There is a movement in academia that is looking at the colonial past of especially the humanities and the social sciences. And there is a movement to decolonize the curriculum, to decolonize the museum, to decolonize archaeological practice. And the idea of decolonization has multiple connotations in the setting of museums, academic publications, archaeological sites, and even in the language of activists and politicians. There is no single definition for it, either conceptually or practically. Decolonization has been used paradoxically to fight the intrinsic coloniality of museum collections and Egyptological practice as a brand to re-establish institutional legitimacy and relevance to audiences in some of the more prevalent implications. Decolonizations has different meanings in different contexts and can mean enabling indigenous scholars, empowering local communities, or rewriting historical narratives or inclusive policies for heritage management. However, at the same time, post-colonial practices have sometimes been more alienating to the different communities and how they continue not to be allowed to engage with their heritage and so perpetuate an inherent legacy of colonialism within Egyptology. And we need to look at the past. We need to look at how the discipline of Egyptology has developed. And a critical history of Egyptology starts in Cairo, which is something we have started in our College of Archaeology and Cultural Heritage at the Arab Academy, where we have a research project that works through the documents found at the Egyptian National Archive on Egyptology. We've never had the chance to write a history of Egyptology from the Egyptian perspective. It's mostly Western scholars writing the histories of Egyptology from their own archives. So the recent publications of the history of Egyptology perpetuated, of course, the usual narrative that glorified colonialism with just a few exceptions. And we cannot look to the future of Egyptology without fully revisiting a modern history of Egyptology that's highly critical. Through our work at the National Archive of Egypt, دار الوثائق القومية, in محافظ الأبحاث, we found a treasure trove of letters, for example, written by the French consulate to Abbas Helmi I to absolve Mariette, the famous Mariette, who is hailed as the father of Egyptology, who protected the Egyptian antiquities, while in fact, what we find in the documentation at the archive is that he was exporting objects he found at the Serapeum in Saqqara illegally to the Louvre. We also find the different firmans that the different consuls had at the Sublime Porte or the archival unit of المعايا السنية, such as the collection exported by Henry Salt or Drovetti or Datanazi, that actually gives it a legal value, but whatever else has left at that time should have left with the permit. And so it gives us also a chance to ask for the restitution and repatriation of many of the other objects that left at that time. For example, here we look at the correspondences of Monsieur Mariette, or Mariette Besha, as he was called. That we have even the street of the Cairo Museum is called Shara Mariette. So Mariette in 1851 had no firman, which is a permission to excavate or export objects. And Abbas Helmi Basha was becoming very annoyed with his unauthorized exploits. Mariette, not so different from today's looter, dug a trench through the middle of Saqqara necropolis to look for the Serapeum. Abbas Basha had to send guards to stop him, and he had to dig at night and bury his finds in the sand before daylight, before he found illegal ways to remove the objects and send them to France. So even Mariette Besha, that we consider him the person who created the Antiquity Service, was in fact a looter. And all of the 176 objects from the Serapeum today in the Louvre were sent illegally, and Egypt has the right to ask for these objects. From what we also find in the archive, dates to a few years later, are letters from Ahmed Kamal Basha. Ahmed Kamal Basha is the first Egyptian archaeologist to be hired to work at the Antiquity Service after Ibrahim Basha Temsah during Mehmet Ali. And we find that Mariette has done his best to not to allow Ahmed Kamal Basha to train in the museum. He would forbid any Egyptian to study the texts in the museum, so they cannot learn the ancient Egyptian language, because he was afraid, Mariette was afraid, that he would actually lose his job. But such inherent colonialism against the Egyptians and not wanting to enable them into the study of their own heritage continued. Here we find a beautiful letter from Ahmed Kamal Basha, claiming that he owns the right to a managerial position. This is from الأشغال, there was the وزارة الأشغال العامة, or the Ministry of Public Works, under which the Antiquity Service was based. So the topic of this letter is مذكرة من أحمد كمال باشا بشأن تعيينه أمينا بالأنتخانة بعد استقصاء بروكشبيك من منصب. فأحمد كمال باشا explains to the Prime Minister why he has the right to take the position. So allow me to read the letter. الأنتخانة فيها مدير فرنساوي وأمين بروسياني واثنان مساعدان للأمين. أحدهما فرنساوي والثاني وطني. وطني here means Egyptian، وهو مقدمه اللي هو أنا يعني. وبلغني أن الأمين بروكشبيك سيقدم استعفاء. معلش هو العربي عربي بتاع القرن ال19. أما الآن أو بعد عودته من الأجازة، وإن المدير اتفق معه أن يقدم هذا الاستعفاء خفية يعني مستخبي، حتى إني لم أخذ به خبرا لكي يتمكن بتعيين فرنساوي من الخارج بعلة معارف خصوصية ينسبها إليه كما هي عادتهم في مثل هذه الأحوال. أحمد كمال باشا المصري في هيئة الآثار المصرية باعت بيشتكي إنه الفرنساويين متفقين إنه هيجيبوا يعينوا حد عشان هو من وراه، عشان هو ما يعرفش فما يقدمش على البوزيشن ده. وبعد كده كاتب أو أن ينقله دارسي وهو مساعد الأمين الفرنساوي بدل بروكشبيك، مع إني أحق منه للأسباب الآتية. أولاً القدم في الخدمة، إن لي 21 سنة وله 6 سنين، ونحن درجة واحدة ومعرفنا واحدة، بل أزيد عنه بمعرفة العربية. ثانيهما إنه لم يكن له دبلومة يمتازها عني. ثالثها إن والده هو تاجر أنتيقات بفرنسا، وبهذا السبب لا يجوز البتة جعله أمينا. رابعا إن المتحف وطني، وإن البلاد المصرية محرومة من معرفة الآثار وعلومها. وكاتب في الآخر تعييني في هذا المحل لا يمس حواس فرنسا ولا إنجلترا، لأنه لم يلحق به فرنساوي ولا إنجليزي ابتداء من إنشاء الأنتخانة إلى الآن، وأمر دولتكم هو الأتم. وماضي أحمد كمال باشا في تاريخ 28 أكتوبر 1894. فبنبتدي نشوف إنه إزاي حتى بعد سنين وسنين فضل التأثير الفرنساوي طبعا، وبعد شوية هنشوف كمان التأثير البريطاني على إدارة الآثار في مصر قعد في إيد الفرنساويين. وحتى يعني أنا كاتبة في الكتاب بس مش حطاها هنا إنه في صحفي فرنساوي بيجي في أول القرن العشرين يقول لو فرنسا خسرت مصر عشان خسرت الحرب قدام الجيش المشترك في 1801 لازم الآثار تفضل تحت الحكم الفرنسي. واحد من الناس، وده كان بيعبر على نفس الأفكار اللي كانت موجودة في الوقت ده. نيجي بعد كده هنا لقانون 1912. تيجي مصر بقى وقت عباس حلمي الثاني. بتقرر معلش let me return back to English احنا بس عشان قرينا الجواب. In 1912 Egypt decides to create the first antiquities law, and it's actually one of the first antiquities laws created. Italy had its first antiquities law in 1902, so this is 10 years after Italy had its first antiquities law to preserve its heritage. So at this time, under Abbas Helmi II, when Egypt decreed the 1912 law based on the 1891 decree, the Khedival decree back then to preserve antiquities, all the different archaeological missions in Egypt protested. This law legalized the partage system and was evenly, that the partage system was also now is currently being critiqued by big professors such as Dr. Murad Kersel at DePaul in Chicago. When Egypt created the 1912 law, the British Academy wrote to the Egyptian government saying that, let me quote again, the letters they officially wrote in 1912 to protest the law. In the case of Greece and Italy, the intimate dependence of modern civilization on that of the Greeks and the Romans will always ensure support of excavation, in spite of complete restriction of exports. But in Egypt, it's not the same position, and interest must be kept alive by showing to foreigners the portable works of sculptures and painting and minor arts she produced in antiquities. Then the Council of the British Association for the Advancement of Science also protested and said, since these foreign investigations are supported almost entirely by voluntary contribution from persons interested in providing equipment for the scientific study of Egyptology in their own countries, there is grave reason to feel that if objects recovered by these expeditions are wholly or for the most part retained in Egypt, or whatever plea of scientific or other necessity, these contributions will be diverted into other branches of learning and to other countries where the policy of the governments is more in accord with the general interests of learning and education. And of course, they continue to the same colonialist narrative by the Royal Asiatic Society, for example. They said, moreover, the Egyptian peasant, al-Fallahin, will be deprived of both direct and indirect benefits. Not only will the large wages for digging annually pay to a considerable body of the peasant folk cease entirely, but local business will diminish in the ratio of the reduction of tourists. A great researcher at University of Stanford called Alison Michael, in her recent publication called Why Those Who Shovel Are Silent, has showed how excavation work has frequently been too unstable and centralized to be a dependable, profitable resource for communities living on or near archaeological remains. Archaeologists and heritage practitioners have overwhelmingly shown this through global case studies. This is just a tiny example of the untold history of Egyptology that needs to be written to understand the power imbalance that continues in the discipline until today. So why this is part of the critical history. This is the first part of the book. Then I move to the second part of the book. Before I move to the second part of the book, let me also discuss here one of the anecdotes that I write in the book by Labib Habashi. In his biography written by Jill Kamel, he writes a story about how one of the foreign excavators who worked with him in Elephantine, he was from Belgium, he took all the photos of his excavations and all his notes and actually presented it as his own findings in one of the conferences in Europe. And Labib Habashi tells Jill Kamel that this very famous quotation that he usurped my moment of glory. So not only they forbid Egyptians from working, they did not want Egypt to have a 1912 law, they also plagiarized and took unlawfully not just the objects, but also the knowledge produced by the Egyptians and presented them as their own. We move then to a section of why Egyptology has not matched the general, has remained an area study. So why Egyptology needs theory, why Egyptology needs to engage better with the general disciplines of humanities and social science. Up until now, Egyptology still has not become a real social science because it has lagged behind archaeological theory. So as Kant says, that theory without practice is empty and practice without theory is blind. And this complex question has also been asked by many archaeologists, such as Kent Weeks, who worked at the Valley of the King, Bruce Trigger, John Baines, and Juan Carlos Garcia. They tried to answer this question. Recently, in one of the volumes created by the Wallace Budge Symposium held at University of Cambridge to answer such important question of why Egyptology has remained an area discipline and not evolved into becoming a social science. And they tried to analyze the intersectionality of Egyptology with other disciplines in the humanities. So such attempts needs to move beyond the inherent ideas of the discipline as trying to put this idea of eternal Egypt in a time capsule in a museum or in an archive or a storeroom. And most of the Egyptologists who met to discuss the discipline said that for Egyptology to progress, there should be an emphasis on the complex relationship between theory and praxis, the past and the present. The latest research has tried to reflect on current archaeology practices in excavations, museums, heritage management, the arts, and in public consumption of Egyptology, as well as how the media presents ancient Egypt. The interpretations made by archaeologists, historians, and heritage professionals are not simply the product of new excavations or archival finds that are being brought to light in an ever-increasing amount, but they also depend on the development of new techniques of inquiry and the changing nature of the questions the research pose when the data is approached. Today, researchers in Egyptology tackle these new corpora of complex data in a new world that does not only focus on analyzing the data to write a historical or a scientific narrative of the archaeological context, but also addresses the power imbalance of 200 years of Western intervention in ancient Egypt. The research questions that we today examine arise not only from academic curiosity, but also from hearing the living talk about their own dead, through analyzing perspectives of contemporary society about its past. This is how traditional archaeology has evolved. There was the traditional archaeology that we all study on our first year of archaeology, how we identify the artifacts, systematics of time and space and history, descriptive culture, and how this actually evolved now into new archaeology and how it has become more part of anthropology as in the American school, and how also it engages today with social theory, how we look through archaeology to think about power and agency, about social structures, about class, about ideology, and about gender. So how can we move from traditional Egyptology is mostly still stuck in the traditional archaeology and has not evolved with the changes in the humanities and social science that happened to the bigger field of archaeology. And we always ask this question today, is archaeology a science or an art? Is it a humanity or a social science? And I like the comment by the British archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler, who responded to this epistemological question. And he said that archaeology is neither a science nor an art. Archaeology is vendetta against the past in the present. I really like how he responds to that. Mortimer Wheeler is one of the biggest British archaeologists. And archaeologists have widely accepted such judgments on the discipline of archaeology as a field that is continuously under debate. Archaeology as a vendetta puts it continuously in the present, in the heart of the cultural political discourse, and it becomes as much more about the present as the past. Egyptian archaeology first started as antiquarianism in the 19th century. Then it evolved through William Matthews Flinders Petrie in the early 20th century to a more scientific method that carried a lot of racism and antagonism to the indigenous cultures of Egypt. The method of the scientific and objective archaeologist in the Sherlock Holmes fashion was faulty, as more subjective archaeology evolved to inquire both about the nature of the subjective and the objective to parallel to the evolution of the social theory. However, Egyptology has continued in its traditional form, resisting the change happening in the wider field of archaeology, social sciences, and humanities. I always like to, many of my students will identify with this because I get my students of critical heritage to read the Muqaddimah or the introduction by Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun, besides his Muqaddimah, created this great idea of cyclical history, of how cultures build one on top of the other, and how cultures are also absorbed into other cultures. But I think one of the brilliant ideas that Ibn Khaldun was involved in is that he tried to understand the past through the present. So reflecting on the current communities. And we know through the great work of Dr. Okesha Daly, who published Egypt in the second millennium, that many of the medieval Arab scholars actually used this to write about the past. So we know that many of the historians of the medieval Arab period would go to the different birba, or the temples. This is how they were called, birba, birbet Isna or birbet Idfu, and they would ask the communities to tell them the stories and the histories of the past. So Ibn Khaldun already, the 12th, 13th century, had this idea that we can understand the past through observing the present and through a relationship with the present. So I like to start the social and the critical theory with Ibn Khaldun, but of course, it starts with Ibn Khaldun, but then we find ourselves in French philosophy of the 20th century, someone like Michel Foucault, who wrote his great work of archaeology of knowledge, his book about discipline and punish, about how museums and academic institutions regulate knowledge, his great work on heterotopia in his article of Other Spaces, where he discusses how museums become this reflection to reality that's unreal. And his philosophizing of the museum space and the museum place. Taban, we cannot forget Edward Said. And Edward Said's Orientalism is actually one of the first writers that identifies that the project of Orientalism starts with Napoleon's Description de l'Égypte. He is from the first philosophers who actually notes this, how the West shapes an image about the Orient through the eyes of the Napoleon campaign, through colonialism. And he explains how the 19th century Egyptology affected this idea of Orientalism, where the subjugation of an operation of the power coupled with colonialist and imperialist ideologies have created thousands of museums filled with objects of the colonized other, al-akhar اللي تحت السيطرة. Not so different, of course, from the image he creates in the Orient in his book. طبعا despite contemporary critiques، النهارده في critiques كتيرة جدا لشغل ميشيل فوكو ولشغل إدوارد سعيد، ولكن their work still continues to show the centrality of power in social practices through archaeology, which is central and intricate relation to power, agency, and control through creativity and oppression. This brings the argument to a connection between discourse and power. Of course, Foucault taught this lesson very well, and he was a good friend of Edward Said, and they would discuss these ideas at many times. I also would like to discuss how Jean Baudrillard would actually focus on how perception created a common idea, where he philosophized the object value system, how the object as the statue or the mummy or the sarcophagus or creates a value system within the society, and how museums actually interplay with this. And he has a famous quotation that says, everything is indiscriminately conserved and archived. We no longer make history, we protect it as if it's an endangered species. Culture is usually understood as a discourse of excellence, that culture is only something that very high society have access to, and the elite can visit the museums, and archaeology becomes the religion of this discourse of excellence, where we are continuously trying to preserve timeless and universal human treasures and making archaeology this elitist affair. And this asks the important questions of who produces the past and why. In Egyptology, the agency of knowledge produced has remained under foreign powers. For example, in 1922, when the Tutankhamun tomb was discovered, Egypt, coming out of the 1919 revolution, filled with nationalistic sentiments, decided to keep the collection. Yet the excavation archive was sent to the United Kingdom and remained in the Griffith Institute at Oxford University. stripping away the agency of all Egyptian archaeologists to the future knowledge production of their past. Despite this, Egypt has fully paid the money spent by Lord Carnarvon to his heirs, which was 34,790 Egyptian pounds. Artifacts are found on excavations, locked in notebooks and databases, and eventually displayed in museums to present the history they are part of metonymically. The forms of display create the space and time for the conception of the display, so the museum becomes a multi-temporal repository of the past, yet spatially alienates the objects from their context. And as Baudrillard has previously explained, the object must be placed in the theory of signification as part of the social constitution of reality. Another French philosopher that I also like his work very much, that also affected archaeology discipline, who is Merleau-Ponty. He wrote this fantastic book called Phenomenology of Perception, and how he tried to explain how we perceive the past, and we actually perceive the environment not only through intellectual understanding, but also through the body, how the smell, the taste, the feelings, and how this is very important when we think about the history, because we try to look at the embodiment of the ancient Egyptian. How did the ancient Egyptian, how can Nefertiti feel at home in Berlin, for example? This is part of the embodiment perception of the past, how we can create the environment of the five senses of the different objects in museums. And of course, we have the gender theory that used a lot of the embodiment to understand how women actually experienced the past. Most of the 200 years of Egyptology was mostly written, the history was mostly written by white men from Europe, but they've missed a lot of how actually women, they write about women, but they do not know how women, for example, one of the most famous examples is how Schiaparelli, who worked in Deir el-Madina, interpreted the birthing chairs. They were birthing chairs, but he actually interpreted them something completely different. So how actually being a woman and looking at gender and gender interpretations improves our ideas and understanding of the past. We move from theory into praxis, what we do on the field. How can we do? And I also like to use the words of a very famous Italian writer, Umberto Eco, who writes that things about which we cannot theorize, we must narrate. If we cannot come with theory, if we cannot relate with theory, we need to come up with an important narrative and a solid narrative together. So Egyptology as praxis today needs to focus on the notion of analysis of whose past we investigate. And how contested is this past between the different stakeholders? We can only write a new historical narrative that decolonizes and democratizes the past through progressive approaches as community archaeology, public archaeology, heritage management, and critical heritage studies. The study of ancient Egypt has been characterized by hierarchical and militaristic, highly tainted with colonial excavation strategies. In the 19th and 20th century, archaeologists hired enormous workforces to move massive volumes of earth as quickly as possible for wages that were as low as possible. Egyptians in the study of ancient Egypt were usually laborers, characterized as unskilled manual labor. So site workers' names, let alone their contributions, were rarely reported. Fertility rituals, play areas, and stories of magic and the jinn were seen as a nuisance to the serious academic work Egyptologists were doing. The intangible heritage has been overlooked, despite local communities valuing it as a central part of their tradition. Local communities hold value of intangible heritage embedded in monumental ruins and the surrounding of the archaeological landscape against those imposed by the government and formal Egyptology. Listening to local community members to learn what local people regarded as important heritage, deserving protection, as they have known these sites through interacting with them through the many activities, and also hearing about them from their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers. Today, such relations are very important. We can no longer think of the 19th century excavation, go just open a tomb in a militaristic fashion like Mariette did with the thousands of workers. Furthermore, today we also think about sustainable development. Most of the archaeological missions, they come work for a month and they leave the rest of the site for Egypt to take care of. So if ancient Egypt would survive for the future, as many of us have experienced in the field, Egyptology has to be thoroughly engaged with sustainable community development. Communities apathetic to the archaeological investigation will likely loot, land grab, or completely neglect the site. Losing the archaeological site context of our past will lead to huge cultural attrition. Such attrition can only be stopped by shifting back archaeological and investigation to be concentrated in the Delta, as has been in the case since 1952, through work with the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 UN Agenda. Archaeological site investigation must be part of development plans forged with communities based on their developmental priorities. These can only be done by engaging Egyptology with more social science fields and international bodies and Egyptian policymakers to change the nature of archaeological practice in Egypt to an inclusive and sustainable field. Indigenous communities need to benefit from the archaeological practice directly. A sustainable, cultural, intellectual, and economic relation has to be the foundation of any site investigation and not just fashionable discoveries. The museum too. The museum, despite the first museums in the world, it was in Ur, here in Galdi, in Ur, in Iraq. We also had the museum in Alexandria. So there is now a notion to say no, museums are Western institutions, but no. In Egypt, we had, and in the Mesopotamia, we had museums before the West actually invented the museums. The problem is in what the museum would hold. You get these museums in the West that are called museums of world museums that has objects from the whole world, and it has this perception of how the West sees the other in the way Edward Said has discussed otherness in his books. The other for these museums represents an important exterior or austerity to be subdued or to be catalogued and analyzed. Through conquering other peoples and assimilating their cultural heritage, the West built its modern identity based on the different hierarchization of the forms of knowledge. Such museums and Egyptological organizations in the West were and still are funded and sponsored by nations, by governments. For long, museums and archaeological institutions competed politically for the ancient Egyptian past. The main axis of Egyptological inquiry was thus shaped by the states uniquely positioned to determine which activities to be funded and supported, and which is culturally significant for imperialist and colonialist interests. And of course, the Egyptian collections in Western museums, you can see here, as Dr. Wagih has discussed at the beginning, of the different Western collections that has objects stolen from Egypt. We have, of course, the Dendera Zodiac that was dynamited of Dendera Temple. We have the Rosetta Stone that was taken as a spoil of war. And we have the bust of Nefertiti, which, of course, was taken by cheating the Egyptian Antiquities Service. But then again, the decolonizing of the Western Museum is not only about restitution and repatriation. It is important, but such universalist museums, we want the objects back to gain our agency. to produce knowledge about it. You do not want the objects just to come back to Egypt and like the archive of the Tutankhamun temple that's at the Griffith, Tutankhamun tomb that's at the Griffith Institute. We also want to restore back the agency for the Egyptians to produce knowledge about the past. And also museums in Egypt. We have the fantastic Museum of Civilization in Egypt that has for the first time this overlay of different cultural periods and different historical periods. And as I always like to explain of how Egypt is this palimpsest of different historical periods, one on top of the other. But we also have other museums that are still compartmentalizing the heritage. So they will have prehistoric, ancient Egypt, Coptic Egypt, Islamic Egypt, then contemporary Egypt. We never see exhibitions, for example, that look to women or a class, or industry, or agriculture, that looks at agriculture from prehistoric to the modern period differently, with objects, with art. We need also to get out of this colonialist narrative of the museum that separates our heritage just by time, where we can look at space and time interacting differently. We also need to teach Egyptology differently at the university. Egyptology at the university needs to be taught differently, where digital heritage the university needs to create calibers who can find jobs. So how many jobs in Egyptology are available on the market? You'll probably find none. But the market needs heritage managers. The market needs museums, people. So the universities that teach Egyptology also need to provide their graduates with different skill sets that makes them find jobs on the job market. We also, part of our new curriculum at the Arab Academy is that we also teach, for example, heritage and media. And this brings me to our next slide, where there is this over-spectacularization of the Egyptian heritage. There is the Indiana Jones and the people wanting to be Indiana Jones that would recycle, for example, discoveries just to be on the media, or we're going to discover the tomb of Cleopatra just for the media, or the tomb of Nefertiti. So this over-spectacularization hurts very much the real scientific, academic Egyptology that's quite nuanced and wants to make Egyptology actually more consumed by the Egyptians and by the indigenous communities around. And the future, and I'll also use another quotation by an Italian philosopher, Antonio Gramsci, that says the task is to compile an inventory of the traces that history has left in us. I think that Egypt, ancient Egypt, is very much alive in all of us, in all of Egyptians. And we cannot just take ancient Egypt, study it, and put it in a museum. This is what Egyptology has been doing for the past 200 years. Egyptology needs to liberate ancient Egypt from the dirty cases full of dust of the museums and actually bring ancient Egypt to be very active in community development. Ancient Egypt needs to create jobs for modern Egyptians that would work in different ideas and different sustainable development projects. The field of Egyptology itself needs to engage with critical theory, needs to engage with the wider disciplines of humanities and social science, rather than remain a small, tiny area study in the field. And I think that with the events that happened in 2011, when people were looting the different archaeological sites on one side, and on one side, people were actually forming a ring around the Cairo Museum to protect it. We know that there are no walls that will protect ancient Egypt. I mean, no matter how high the walls we create, this will not protect ancient Egypt. What will protect ancient Egypt and move it to the future will be strong relations between the living and the dead, between the present and the past. And with this, I thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moon.
Yeah, very good. And it's a good introduction to your book. I can see the professor in you, the way you give the talk. And if you please, if you have a question, if you can go to the reaction and raise your hand so I can give you the chance. So let me see who has raised his hand. Get the صبح أول. Okay. So can you unmute? Let me unmute you.
Unmute.
Okay, good. Go ahead.
مساء الخير يا دكتورة مونيكا.
مساء
نشكر
النور.
حضرتك على لو مراتي سمعت الكلمة دي هتزعل منك.
لا خلاص.
طيب